Hello and welcome to WePC Benchmarks. My name is Seb, and today we are looking at Humankind. The game was released a few weeks ago, and can be found on multiple platforms including Game Pass. It is a game not too dissimilar from the Civilization series, but published by Sega. So let's take a look at how well it performs. We'll be running the game at 1080p, 1440p, 4K, except for the 710, and at the highest quality level of fantastic. So, we do start off with the GT 710. And this one doesn't run too well, so we do just to try to lower the settings at 1080p. And you can see that at the highest settings, we get a result of 4 average FPS, a 1% of 3, and a 0.1% of 3 FPS. Lowering the setting to the fastest graphical settings, and we do triple our FPS, and get an average of 13 FPS with a 9 FPS 1% and 0.1%. Next up we have the GT 1030. It gives us a bit of a slight performance increase over the 710. We get an average of 9 FPS at 1080p, an average of 6 FPS at 1440p, and an average of 2 FPS at 4K, with a 5 FPS, 4 FPS and 1 FPS 1%, and a 5 FPS, 4 FPS and 1 FPS 0.1% at the same resolutions. So not quite the ideal scenario, but I'm sure lowering the settings to fastest at 1080p might just about get you to the 20s, so it is slightly better. Our next GPU is the GTX 1050 Ti. It is quite the increase in average frames. We see that increasing to an average of 27 frames per second with a 1% of 22 and 0.1% of 21. Then at higher resolutions, we have 22 FPS average, 14 FPS 1% and 10 FPS 0.1% at 1440p. And at 4K, we get 9 FPS average, 8 FPS 1% and 0.1%. Quite a manageable amount at 1080p and 1440p. Maybe if we lowered the quality at 4K, it would be manageable too. Up next we have the RX 570, which averages 35 FPS at 1080p, with 28 FPS 1% and 27 FPS at 0.1%. Then at 1440p we get an average of 30 FPS, with a 26 FPS 1% and 26 FPS 0.1%. And at 4K we get 14 FPS average, with 12 FPS 1% and 12 FPS 0.1%. So a nice stable card to use for the game, and it is playable at all resolutions, as these strategy games don't require the highest of frame rates for a good experience. The next GPU is the 2070 Super, another step up from the previous card. It gives us an average of 104 FPS at 1080p, and with 79 FPS 1% and a 0.1% of 51. This card also gives us good performance at higher resolutions, with the results at 1440p being an average of 81 FPS, with a 1% of 60 and a 0.1% of 57. Then at 4K we get an average of 45 FPS with a 1% of 38 and a 0.1% of 25. Then we have the RX 5700 XT. It gives us an average of 87 FPS with a 1% of 74 and a 0.1% of 74 as well. At 1440p we get a 68 FPS average with a 1% of 58 and 0.1% of 57. Then at 4K we get an average of 37 FPS with a 27 FPS 1% and a 27 0.1% as well. Now we move into the newer generation, and we have the 3060 Ti, which averages around 116 FPS with a 1% of 90 and a 0.1% of 56. Upping the resolution to 1440p we get an average of 90 FPS with a 1% of 68 and a 0.1% of 62. And then at 4K we get an average of 51 FPS with a 39 1% and a 37 0.1%. Moving over to AMD with the 6600 XT, we get an average of 81 FPS at 1080p with lows of 73 and 72 FPS, 1% and 0.1% respectively. At 1440p we get an average of 65 FPS, 57 at 1% and 57 at 0.1%. And then at 4K we get an average of 36 FPS with a 1% of 33 and a 0.1% of 33 also. We move on to the last two cards, and firstly we have the 3080, with which we get an average of 154 FPS, and with lows of 109 1% and 52 at 0.1%. Then increasing the resolution to 1440p, we get an average of 124 FPS, with a 1% of 93 and a 0.1% of 82 FPS. And then at 4K we get an average of 76 FPS, with a 1% low of 57 and a 0.1% low of 30. Finally, we come to the 6800 XT, which averages at 141 FPS, with the 1% low of 122 and 0.1% of 119 FPS. We then move up to 1440p, where we get an average of 113 FPS, with a 1% of 98 and a 0.1% of 97. And finally, at 4K, we get an average of 64 FPS with a 52 1% and a 51 0.1%. So there we have it, the benchmark for Humankind. It can't run on everything quite well, but the frame rate isn't the most important part in the strategy games. It's not like FPS shooters where you have to instantly make responses, but you have time to make one. Even then, from the 1050 Ti up, we have manageable frame rates above 20 FPS, but for 4K, you will need something like a 2070 Super at least. Thanks for watching, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.